I think we're moving into the Q&A portion, and we have had questions pouring in from the audience for each of you. I'm going to start by just touching on one of the things that comes up in little bits and pieces throughout some of your presentations, but we haven't really solved for it in this. I think it's more raised questions than not. So there are a lot of different groups that get left out. Brian, your data just sort of showed, you know, sales and other groups feel like they need to be in the office more, but, you know, companies may feel like they can do it from home. There are a lot of, there was some discussion around the minority groups and women who tend to be challenged, face more of the challenges of remote work. So how do we identify those workers in our different environments, and how do we solve for those? How do we elevate them and make sure that their needs are also taken care of?
That's a great question. I mean, I didn't hint at that. When we do these studies, we have like 9 different demographic categories. So it's everything from where you work, are you an individual contributor, your tenure at the company, what generation are you, your location, obviously, department. But we do ask gender, we do ask ethnicity, so that we can actually dig into the kind of aggregate view of a company and say, hey, are there things that are popping out here that surprise us, that are different? I will say, like when it comes to gender ethnicity, we're not finding a consistent theme. Companies are all unique in their methodology and their position for how they handle those things. But definitely we've seen the impact. You know, we all know that women were impacted 4 times more than men in this. And that's where some of this anxiety comes. Hey, we are all saying this fall return to office, when we haven't necessarily taken a deep breath to be fully assured that the life part is on track with a return to school and a return to normalcy. But yeah, those are the types of things that we look at, how it's impacting the experience of the workforce. And then we can uncover after that through focus groups and kind of undermining, hey, what's the cause and effect of that? Great,
thank you.
If I could just add to that, I think that is exactly like one of the challenges, because all those things that you mentioned, they all impact on the experience, and they may be kind of, you know, it becomes a massive matrix essentially, where just as an example, what we've seen in our data, having also asked a number of demographic questions, when we look at younger employees, it was mentioned earlier as well that younger employees have had a slightly poorer experience working from home. And we see that in the data as well. However, at the same time, the difference is actually not that significant. And what we've seen in the data is that it's because on one hand, the experience for younger employees is brought downwards, because they are more likely not to have a proper work setting at home. They're likely to be flat sharing or house sharing or so forth. But then at the same time, younger employees tend to need less of their environment. They have a more simple work profile, and it's easier for an environment to support what they do, which then on the other hand brings the experience upwards. And as a kind of an average, you end up with something in the middle. So the difference between younger and older employees isn't that significant, because there's so many different factors that actually play a role. So I totally agree. You need to collect the data, and again, as we said many times earlier on this in this webinar, that you can't just rely on averages and think that because average numbers that are published say that younger employees, it's more challenging, then that automatically applies to your organization. You need to really collect the data for your organization to understand all the ins and outs and the massive complex matrix that is impacting on all of that.
You know, Peggy, just to punctuate that, we did have one client with 900 people, 23 baby boomers. That's it. They were by far the worst scoring on experience compared to every other company. They were essentially millennial driven. Yeah, but we have seen the baby boomers. They tend to have their own office. They have mature, they may be empty nesters. Their life condition is a little bit more conducive to getting work done at home. I literally had a millennial tell me, I'm trying to be on a conference call and they're doing a beer bong party next door. And they actually want to run to a co-working spot because that's a business environment. But I was amazed to see a young company that kind of, for all intents and purposes, removed the baby boomers really struggling.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, you know, we see a lot of companies that are both at the same time afraid of losing their institutional knowledge and also concerned about the fact that sometimes older workers can't keep up with new technology and trends like remote working and all of the technology that's required to have a positive experience around that. So I think that's very valid. Kate, Ben, any thoughts from you on that? How do we support our urgently struggling employees?
We need to be polling more frequently. I mean, a once a year kind of polling just isn't going to do it. We need to recognize that when they come back, particularly in this interim, it's really going to be a struggle. I mean, even from the point of view of it's noisy. You know, I've been sitting in a quiet environment, those who don't have children. And, you know, when I first went to the airport a couple of weeks ago, it was frightening. But I also think that this whole thing has brought us to a place of more empathy because the initiatives are coming from the C-suite. It's more inclusive across the functions. And so we're seeing that you know, diversity, inclusion, and skill building and all of those kinds of things, they're all coming together and they're being talked about at the same time. So when you talk about inclusive meetings, how do you make sure, you know, the person who isn't there is engaged? It takes a great deal of intentionality. And I think that we're going to be more attuned to that. I know that my clients are very concerned about how they make this hybrid experience equitable.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, not too much to add. I mean, obviously, echo Kate's point, obviously, totally biased here. I think that, you know, data is very helpful in understanding this. And I think there's two aspects to that, right? Obviously, I think of it from the behavioral side, but again, I would also say from the sort of experience side as well, like they both matter, right? It's just one can come in faster than the other in terms of, you know, if a team's work hours are getting out of hand, if a team is completely siloed off, that's something that you'll probably get faster from behavioral data. But there are, of course, a lot of things that you won't catch from that. You won't catch how do people feel about that. I do worry about so groups where like statistics or numbers like can't actually tell you what their experience is because the numbers are so low, right? So for example, like there are just very few Black executives at like most companies in the US, right? And so if you use statistics, like it just, if you aggregate it like we do, like you won't even see that, right? And so I do think there's a limit to what analytics and statistics can tell you. And I think that thinking about these issues holistically, and that involves really digging in. Again, this is not what we do, right? But I think that this is very important for companies to dig into because, and also just to be clear, like those issues, these existed pre-COVID, they will continue to exist. These are societal issues. That doesn't absolve us of responsibility, but it means we're gonna have to do a lot of work to do this. And also, there's going to be data that we just don't know that we should be capturing about like what, you know, for example, like we're talking about people with kids having a harder time in general, right? Not all companies have that data. And if you do have it, there are actually also like legal reasons why you might not want to analyze it. And so there's all these questions there about, would you even see that? And again, this gets to like, what are the limits of some of these approaches beyond like you do then have to dig in a lot more. And so I do hope people understand like I think there's two parts of this. Like a lot of good management practices are even more important, right? Like these are things like if you were a good manager before, like getting to know your team, getting to know frontline employees was important. It is still important. Now analytics can help give you understand where to focus your attention. You'll probably be on this team in this division. It still won't tell you why that's happening, what's going on. And this, I think, holistic approach is very, very important.
Yeah, I think just like in any relationship, you have to create that culture of trust and transparency in order to have a successful team, right? So, and really open people up to feel like they can share what they need, and that's not always the case. there's been a lot of talk about back to the office, not back to the office, this amazingly dynamic ecosystem that we're all in the midst of right now. There's a question from the audience. What are the top 3 must-haves operationally in an office to make it most attractive? And where should one spend, which is the big question, right? And my guess is each of you is going to say it's different for every office and team and building, but I'd love to hear it from you. And if there are any tips we can share, I'm sure they'll be appreciated.
Well, for me, it's not about foosball tables and free beer.
Oh, come on, Kate. We can't have any fun.
You know, it is about good coffee, though, because that comes up in just about every survey I've ever seen. So, okay, get the coffee right. And it's fixing all the things that we know have been broken. You know, people, the biggest complaint is noise. We've got to fix that. We fix it by allowing them to do their quiet work at home. But we have to understand that they're still going to need to do some quiet work when they're there. They're not just going to be constantly collaborating. So those are just my initial thoughts.
Thank you.
I totally support the one on noise. It's something that we certainly see, even when we look at the best workplaces, so those Leesman Plus workplaces, noise is still a challenge in many of them. So not even the best workplaces get really great scores on satisfaction with noise. And I think that, I mean, as you said, it's always been an issue. And I think it's going to be an even bigger issue now because, first of all, employees have become used to, in many cases, that, you know, the home environment supports those activities that require acoustic privacy really well. And second of all, I think the way that a more hybrid way of working, where there's more ad hoc conference calls and whatnot, is going to create even more noise in one way, or more activities that potentially could create noise in those environments where you know, other people may try to focus. But the one thing that what I would add to the list is the one thing, when we compare the most outstanding workplaces to the average ones, the biggest satisfaction difference we find in satisfaction with variety of different types of space. So that as a, you know, as a feature, what sort of variety, what does it mean? Back to your point, Calandra, it depends on the organization, but it's basically about getting that variety right that supports whatever the employees in that particular organization does. So certainly not the, you know, the kind of offices with identical desks and maybe some meeting rooms and that's it. I think that will not be the attractive office to get people back to.
Thank you.
And
I think from my perspective, one, take the subjectivity out of this. Everything we're voicing today is how you can take a data-driven approach to get in tune with your people. What drives them? If I know what drives them, like I find it interesting. We've got about 40 different attributes that can be real estate, technology, amenities, services. On average, only 8 to 10 of these, or 20-25%, drive the experience of people. If you know what they are, and on average, half are doing great and the other half broken. So now I'm down to 4 to 5 things. If you start with the data and get the insights on what's driving people, then you know where to kind of tune the engine. The other elements is we really got to get the tech right. It's got to be a seamless, easy to use technology that allows us to connect with the remote workforce when we're in the office. A sign of success or failure from what I've seen is people actually in a conference room who leave for their desk to get on a Zoom call because they can't figure out the tech in the room. Okay, the time is now. If you want to bring people back in November, fix that now. And then lastly, you know, how do we take this hospitality mindset to be easy to do business with? People don't want to be lost. You got to get them over their anxiety and show you that, we said it earlier, empathy. Take care of their needs so that they can focus on the work. I think all of those 3 kind of ring fence around how do we keep our culture thriving in a distributed fashion. Our data is showing is that didn't work. And we got to fix it because not everyone's coming back. And I don't know until we spend time, but I do think those 3 steps of being in tune, fix the tech, and take hospitality mindset will go a long way.
Great. Ben.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. It depends. We all said it, but like it really depends, which is frustrating but true. The one thing that I would just say is like you need to make your environment. It needs to be able to change. All the things people just talked about, you should be able to change the next quarter, right? Like it could be you actually could want the foosball table this month, and then next quarter not want it. But it depends on what you want to do. It could be that for this team, right, that they need to focus internally, and maybe it's foosball that really actually helps them. I'm just making it up, obviously, right? But the idea that next quarter, the work that they do is changing. And so you need to be able to say, I'm going to swap that out, right? Now, that's a very different way of thinking about these things, but people have shown how resilient they are, right? Like everyone's made this point, like people went to work from home. We didn't need a 6-month change management process to get people to work from home effectively, right? They were able to do it in 2 weeks, okay? So in a similar way, if I take away the foosball table, people are going to survive and can adapt. And we know this. And so that's a real opportunity, right? So if we design the workplace such that we have things, but that we are constantly changing them because our work constantly changes, like it's a tool, right? All of these are tools. Should use it 5 days a week? Well, maybe for some teams, you should use it 5 days a week. Maybe for some, never, right? But it's because it changes how people work. And so if how people work changes every week, you need some stability, you need some planning, but you say roughly once a quarter, you make some significant changes. That seems reasonable, and also starts to take advantage of all this data as well as the just dynamic nature of work.
That's great. Well, in response to that question, we just gave 6 to 8 really good tips. So they asked for 3, they got more than they bargained for. That's a great thing. Bob, I am mindful of time. Do we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, or do you have some parting thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
Calandra, I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll just wrap it up. It'll only take me a minute.
Okay, perfect. So one other question is, as there seems to be a lot of confusion even still, right, after 1.5 years of doing this, around how to onboard remote workers and immerse them in a culture of work. And during my presentation, I mentioned I had a conversation with Kate North from Colliers yesterday, who I think several of you know, and she was saying, no, it's not about that, right? Your culture is how work gets done. But if you're onboarding a remote employee who has never been part of your team before, it's very different because they don't have those synergies and connections yet. Brian mentioned that in his data, those people actually fare better because they don't come in with a set of expectations already, right? So this is all new to them, and maybe that's a good thing. But what are your tips for onboarding remote workforce and making that a successful transition? And then there also was a follow-on question to that, which is how do you then retain that talent?
Maybe if I could jump in a little bit at the beginning. So we haven't written this up yet, so it's a preliminary analysis. It does appear that new employees at companies, people have joined in the last, at this point, almost 1.5 years, they have significantly narrower networks than people who joined previously, and I'm comparing them like month to month, right? So people who joined, who were at their company for 1 year and then get to COVID, like have much broader networks, more weak ties than the other folks. The issue that's relevant is that there's the cultural reasons, which we could talk about, but even if you're just selfishly looking at it from an individual perspective, those ties are related to you getting promoted and getting paid more, right? So that's an issue. And then you talk about retention, those are other issues there. So, but that's an average. So what I can say is that all the things that we've been doing now on average don't work, just in general, in terms of effectively onboarding folks. And that's not to say they might not like it, but they might like it. It's a question of long-term, will you probably keep them? I'd say if I had to bet on average, it's probably not the case. And so I think figuring out ways, and I will say that the different virtual events that folks do, they have short-term effects, but in general, those effects in terms of creating new relationships fade after about 6 weeks. So you just need to keep doing new things. Basically, it's going to be a lot of work for that. But you need, if that's what you are investing in, if you're going to have a significant number of people who are not in the office, then that's a choice and that's fine. But you should probably have a team who what their job is to curate and constantly change up these sort of events, because like that's what's clearly necessary.
If I can just add let's not replicate the way we used to do it, right? 60% of people quit in the first 2 years. We weren't onboarding and the majority of them do it the first 6 months. We weren't doing it right to begin with. So, let's use technology to find a better way to do it.
Well, to that point, it's like, it's not so much the onboarding I'm worried about, it's the fact we lose them in year 2 to 3. What's causing the dip? So how do you keep people once they're here?
Yeah.
This has been a great conversation, very impressive. I think thanks to all of you, lots of great information, and I think you exceeded everybody's expectations with regard to the data discussed. There's like so much to absorb in this conversation. So I'd like to thank the panel. Calandra, thanks for doing a great job and kicking things off this morning. Kate, all your information, Ben, Peggy, and Brian, you guys were just awesome. So thank you very much.